I dragged and dropped a little blue line connecting an IB outlet to my nib. This is saying add that recognizer to that view object on the screen. So that is the rectangular shape that's going to listen for this pan gesture. And pinching, essentially the same thing. Okay, any questions on how we set that up? Thinking back that, again, the structure is the same as last week. No? OK. All right, so now let's look at the part that does all of the thinking. So handle pan. This is where it gets a little complex, but this is just the result of reading through exactly what each of these functions does. A lot of this, again, is C. And the first thing that happens here is that we first request from the UI image view, that container containing the image, something called a CG point translation. So this is essentially 0, 0 by default. And then the next line, we're making an affine transformation scale, which is essentially saying by how much do you want to grow or shrink Rob along the x and the y axis. And then we go ahead and ask, make a translation. Translation refers to by how much do you want to shift Rob, to the right, to the left, up or down, or along some diagonal by adding those two axes together. And then lastly, this last line of code actually applies that transformation, that changing in scale, bigger or smaller, and that shifting up, down, left, or right to whatever the object is, which is, again, that UI image view. So those several lines of code, which are at each point essentially declaring a C struct, a C struct, a C struct that's being populated by the return values of these functions on the right-hand side, they're then being applied in this final line. So what is the role played by these last few lines down here? Why are we not done as soon as we apply the transformation? Yeah. Exactly. Good. Because we're doing some additive math, especially when it comes to the translation, we're taking into account where Rob began on the entire screen. So if we wanted him to not snap back to the default location each time you drag or drop him, we have to simply update those local instance variables. Yeah?
Along these lines, when I pan slowly on a screen, does this event fire several times or only once?
Good question. It does fire several times. Otherwise, when I clicked on Rob's face, albeit in the simulator there, you wouldn't have seen anything happen until I let go. So it does fire at a particularly fast frequency so that you can respond essentially pixel by pixel. Good question. Yeah?
Is there a way to set that off, like that continuous to like?
You can change the rate. The default is set by default, but you can override it so that you can respond in different ways. Much like with the long press, by default, it's roughly 2 seconds before Rob's face would have triggered that UI alert view last week. And that's who you can raise or lower programmatically when declaring the gesture recognizer. Good question. Yeah?
So can you go back to the previous, not go scrolling down?
Uh-huh.
So the reason we do it here is actually we can use IB action to do all this, right?
Say that again?
We can use IB actions instead of do this instead of like write down those.
So recall, these are not IB actions. So IB actions are how we declare methods inside of a class when we want objects inside of a nib to talk back at them, or more generally for UI views to talk back at them when a user interacts with them. In this case, it's the gesture recognizer, which is a class that Apple has provided with us, that is responsible for invoking these methods.
Okay.
So it's not quite the same use case because these messages are being passed by this recognizer class.
So for anything like in the nib, if I want to access for that, I should give a property for that, right?
Typically, an IB outlet property. So typically, if you want to connect your code to a interface that you created with Interface Builder in a .xib file, then yes, you do exactly that. And that is the reason why, if we scroll up to the part we glossed over earlier, I have two things declared as properties. One is the scale, which, as we'll see, is just a way of remembering when I pinch what the scale factor is for Rob if it's not 1.0 by default. And image view is very typical. Notice that we have IB outlet here, and we've seen this in a number of examples in past weeks. This is my mechanism for actually linking my code to the UI image view so that I can actually apply that recognizer and listen for those finger touches. Good question. So Pinching is going to pretty much similar in spirit, even though some of the function calls will be a little bit different. Let me scroll this over just a bit. And handle pinch is the method that's going to get invoked when you're using the two finger to go separate or closer together. And now we have this first. I'm declaring a CG float struct. So again, here too, it looks like a class, looks like an object thereof, but this is again just capitalized to be consistent with Apple's tradition for C style structures. This is a CG float, which is just some representation of a floating point value. CG affine transform scale is doing a line of code similar to before, where we take the current scale and multiply it by some factor. And notice that the factor has been passed in to us. So one of the things this recognizer does is it figures out how far away did your fingers move in that split second of time, and then it informs this method what that difference is so that you can scale accordingly. Then if we look down here, we're doing a translation. This time we're not actually moving Rob, because recall we only want to move Rob when we're panning, not when we're pinching. So he's going to stay put but grow from wherever my fingers are moving closer or farther away from each other. And then we apply these two things again, much like we did previously. And then lastly, all we do is remember that change in scale so that when I do it again, he doesn't snap back to the default 1.0 resolution to start anew. All right. Any questions then? So we've seen some building blocks now for swiping, up, down, left, right, for touching, for pinching, for clicking and dragging. And so with those, for your third project, if you choose to do something in iOS that actually has UI interactions beyond what's possible out of the box with Interface Builder, realize that these are the basic building blocks even for, say, a simple game. And we'll put these to the test later tonight when we implement an age-old game of sorts. All right. And you might see an allusion to it right there. All right. So, questions on the basics of graphics before we move on to things that are useful to have in your toolkit, but then we'll come back full circle to the application of two-dimensional graphics, actually moving on their own without human interaction. OK, so a design question then. So totally changing gears for just a moment. Localization refers to what process when writing code? OK, internationalization. So not just naively assuming that every one of your users is going to speak English and read English, but rather might have some other native tongue. And you might want to cater to that audience so that they actually download your app, use your app, can understand your app, whatever the reasons. But this is problematic because we've gotten into the habit thus far of writing quite a lot of code in what's essentially English, since Apple came from the US, but also quite a lot of strings, quite a lot of NS strings inside of double quotes, maybe prefixed with an @ sign. So this is kind of problematic because I feel like if I want to suddenly support Mandarin or Spanish or any other language to which I might want to localize my application, now I have to do a whole lot of copy-paste. And any file that has a quoted string like hello world, I'm going to apparently need to copy my viewcontroller.h and maybe make a separate one for each language, viewcontroller.m, a separate one for the languages. Like, surely this isn't the way. Because if there's some 50, 60 languages you might even want to support, I mean, that's a nightmare to have that much code lying around, if only because now if you want to make a change, you have to make it in dozens of places. So what's a smarter approach? And let me preface this with someone who's never internationalized an application before. How would you go about solving this problem? All right. Mm-hmm.
So you potentially store all the strings that you want in p-lists and then just load it from the p-list in your file, and I think it would automatically do it if you say like this p-list is for US version, this p-list is for German version.
Uh-huh.
And then I think it might automatically just do that based on what the user's language said.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And the principle that I'll highlight there is the fact that you're proposing that we factor out the strings. So you can write all of your code in English or pseudo-English in Objective-C or C or whatever the language is. But if you at least factor out the strings that have to change based on the user's end language by putting them in some central file, now you can keep separate your code, your business logic, so to speak, from your actual data. In this case, the strings that the user sees. So you're indeed right. The way Apple typically does this for desktop or iOS applications is you have a plist file, which is just an XML file underneath the hood. But so far as we care, it's just a text file that we can therefore edit. And if we have a separate file for English, a separate file for Mandarin, a separate file for Spanish, we can essentially tell iOS, the operating system, depending on what language the user's iPhone or iPad is in, load the appropriate plist file for me. So in fact, you've seen a few different things. We'll use a file that typically ends in .strings, but it's the same exact idea. And it's even simpler than a plist in that we just write things in the form of text, no XML whatsoever. So let's go ahead and do an example here. Let me open up Xcode, create a new project with just a single view. Let me then proceed to name this, let's say, Hola1. I'll bias things toward English and Spanish for now. I'm going to go ahead and leave automatic reference counting checked. I'm going to leave everything else